Darkest Dungeon 2's hero balance has been interesting to follow, to say the least. While I overall feel it's gotten a bit better over the course of the game's lifespan, there are still several heroes that feel just as over or under-tuned as when they released, and others that despite being overall adequately buffed still have huge flaws in their kit. In this video, I'll talk about the current general standing of the heroes in relation to one another and what it means to be too strong or too weak in DD2, at least in my opinion. I'll talk about some issues I have with some of Red Hook's hero rebalances, especially as of their last couple Steadfast Stewards updates, and I'll lastly spend a bit of time talking about how Red Hook's balancing PEMDAS, so to speak, seemingly screwed them in the long term. Okay, so before we discuss balance in general, I'm going to try and lay a foundation for how I look at and rate these characters against one another. Basically, in my opinion, any character in this game can be S tier on your typical S through F tier list. It's just a matter of how much quote-unquote input they need to start popping off to that degree. I'm intentionally using such a broad term because honestly this input can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. It could be just a quirk, or it could be slotting a specific team member into your party to feed them. They might demand a precious starting mastery point, or they might be scratching their neck like an unstable crack junkie begging for the Eldritch Gods to supply you with their class trinket. Maybe a hero is a bit lackluster against a particular boss, but they can excel if you feed them the right matchup. This gets really complicated, especially when you consider how drastically this varies with paths, but the point is there are a lot of different types of input, but a generally, and I mean very generally, well-designed character will carry a load proportional to the input and skill the player provides them with. With all that being said, here is roughly how I would rank the characters. However, the ranking itself, while maybe an interesting baseline for other discussion, isn't as important as the tiers. Whether or not you agree with my exact ranking of these characters doesn't really matter for the point I'm trying to get across. Hell, you could think Grey Robber is the absolute best in the game for all I care, but you probably would still agree that at sometimes, characters, and especially certain paths of those characters, feel like they need the stars to align on a perfectly clear Tuesday evening falling on a double-digit day of the month to keep up with the likes of the top tiers. And the sad thing is, I think that typically the more interesting and complex and dynamic a character's kit is, the lower they tend to fall on most roster rankings. Now, I think it's fine that easier to pilot characters that are strong exist, but it's really unrewarding as a player to get really comfy on some of those more intricate character kits, only to switch back to more flagellant and clean house way harder and way easier. I think one of the saddest examples of this is Runaway, who represents many of the things I dislike about the 2 Steadfast Stewards updates we've received last year. Let's just look at Wanderer to start. Bonnie has for a long time suffered from only having a handful of abilities that actually consistently get high value. That's not to say her other abilities can't be situationally useful or shine with a certain build and team comp, but again, practically anything in this game can shine, we're just concerned with how much it takes to get there. I was really hoping for that Steadfast Stewards update to bring up her other more interesting skills to compete with these few comparatively boring abilities, but even with the changes they received, I still rarely see players, myself included, reaching for these options over what has long been dominant in her kit. These issues only get even worse with her new paths. Before, Bonnie had 2 decent but straightforward paths that felt like upgrades to Wanderer, and 1 bad path that felt noticeably worse. After the update, Bonnie found herself with 3 complicated paths, but not only did they not help the underrepresented aspects of her kit shine, 2 of them also shot Smokescreen down to being much worse than before, making her strong options even more limited. And even on those more complicated payoff and setup combo type paths, you know what the best thing to do still is? Same as before, just ignore the majority of the paths mechanics and spam the good abilities. By trying to add more depth to Bonnie's kit, they honestly just made the simple strong stuff stand out even more, and Bonnie felt just as in need of a rework as before. And this sucks because it took years after Bonnie's release for her to get this sort of attention, and it amounted to ultimately very little functionally changing. Oppositely, a character like Leper, who still has a lot of issues with his kit, but was gifted a completely brain-dead "it's such high value you should practically always press this" type of button, shot up like 2 tiers almost entirely because of said change. His paths also all feel stronger and less gimmicky now, but this too came at a cost. None of his paths really feel as distinct from each other as they did before. That's not to say that they were spectacularly designed before, I know, but at the very least, playing one path felt very distinct from playing the others. They each had their own identity. Now, the best thing about each path is just the fact that they hit hard. Even Poet just feels like an off-damage path that doesn't feel super functionally different anymore. I think now's a good time to talk about what I believe to be the key issues holding back DD2's hero balance: Red Hook's order of operations and the release schedule. Now, to be clear, everything I'm about to say isn't an attempt to poke at Red Hook or really even to say that they should have done X differently for their approach. I obviously have no idea what goes on during the development process of their game, or any game for that matter, and I'm just attempting to highlight key issues that I've seen arise over my time with this game, and any suggestions I might have in this segment have somewhat blissfully assumed that they would be easy to implement, which I know they probably would not be. Okay, so let's first start with the smaller topic. What do I mean by order of operations? I essentially mean the order in which Red Hook has gone about balancing and tweaking the different aspects of their game. This includes things like the game's economics, difficulty flames, enemies, bosses, obstacles, node rewards, meta progression, and of course its heroes. Red Hook has done a decent job of balancing all of these things in tandem, but I would argue that the heroes deserve a bit more attention than everybody else. Heroes are the most consistently present aspect of DD2. You pick a character at the start of your run and, for the most part, you are stuck with them for the next several hours. While a certain enemy may appear every now and then, and major bosses may have a noticeable effect on how you route and plan your run, your heroes are an absolute constant. You bring them to every encounter, you constantly have their relationships, stress, masteries, potential trinket pickups, and more in the back of your mind. They are simply the biggest deciding factor to how a run plays out. Not only that, there are way less heroes than enemies in the game. Therefore, it seems only logical that heroes would first undergo some large amount of equalizing and balance changes, and then the enemies would be brought in check. This would also mean we'd only have to balance all the enemies around 15 heroes, rather than balance the heroes around the whopping 100 plus enemies. However, if you couldn't tell from how I've been wording this, that's not what Red Hook did. In fact, they kinda did the opposite of first focusing on the enemy balance and then pivoting into largely working on hero balance for the last couple of years. Again, I'm not saying their approach was objectively wrong for them to take, or that it maybe didn't have its upsides, but it is seemingly a big part of this game's history of hero imbalance. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, yeah, we get it, you rattled on long enough about this, but come on, this at least means we'll get a pretty quick release schedule for tuning up the heroes to match the enemies, and then everything will be squeaky clean, right? Well, problem number 2, that funny little release schedule I mentioned earlier. Okay, moving on from the balancing PEMDAS, let's turn our attention to February 2024, the first of the big hero reworks. With this patch, Highwayman and Grave Robber got some pretty substantial and pretty well thought out changes. Highwayman's ridiculously strong outlier of a path, Sharpshot, was brought in check and made way more interesting, and his weaker paths were made stronger and given, again, more interesting utility to help lift them up to Sharpshot's level. Grave Robber, the far weaker hero, was given plenty of buffs across all of her paths, and for the first time in the game's history, she felt honestly really solid, now competing as one of the best damage dealers in the game while still having clear intended weaknesses. Overall, the patch was just really good. Not only were the changes in good taste with the devs addressing the most commonly complained about issues, for the most part, they were also just fun and show that the devs had a clear new path design philosophy that far outshined the previous ideas for the system. Paths for the longest time had been criticized for serving more as boring band-aid fixes or blatant upgrades for characters rather than the promised specializations that allowed players familiar enough with the game to branch out and experiment with alternative playstyles and synergies. But, thanks to their great work tuning up the base kit of these two characters, Grave Robber and Highwayman's paths were able to finally live up to what the system was always meant to be. Would you believe me if I said that Grave Robber is back to being mid? Yeah, so this is where the long, drawn-out problem begins. Despite this rework being pretty great and some of the others after it being similarly well done, particularly the Man-at-Arms, Jester, and Vestal one, it took nearly 2 years to get through all the hero reworks. You're likely familiar with the term power creep, the issue of developers adding new characters or items to the game that outshine previous ones, and that is definitely felt in the current iteration of DD2. Since the aforementioned Grave Robber and Highwayman reworks, we have gotten an entirely new game mode with a couple dozen new enemies, 3 distinct questline modules, and even had the release of an entire character, and practically nothing has been changed about either of them to help them keep up. To an extent, it doesn't matter if a rework you made years ago was well done. Certain characters simply require at least semi-frequent care to stay on a strong standing. Now, this obviously isn't the case for all the characters, like Man-at-Arms and Jester are still sitting pretty comfortably, I'd say, despite their rework being the one to follow Grave Robber and Highwayman's. But as the game trudges along and more time seems to pass between hero updates, the problem becomes more and more noticeable for the affected characters. If DD3 ever ends up being a thing, 1, there goes another few hundred hours of my life, I guess, And 2, I really hope that Red Hook makes some system-wide changes that opens up the gameplay loop to allow for these more complex, combo-centric hero kits. If I had to name one solution that comes to mind, I think it would be extending the current 4-round rule of thumb a bit. For those who don't know, the 4-round rule is a term used by a lot of people in the community that basically refers to the idea that you should typically be ending your combat encounters in around 4 turns. And there's obviously exceptions to this, like boss fights and when you might want to stall, but most of the time, if you're going over that soft limit, something's wrong. I think if DD3 ever becomes a thing, balancing the game around a higher number of rounds, while it will definitely create a lot of new issues to be addressed, it would allow the game to open up to so many new teams and characters like Duelist who take a turn to come online. It's, again, certainly not an easy change or one that I even expect to come to pass, but I think something around that level of drastic needs to happen in order for more design space to be opened up, because even after all the years of DD2 updates that have come about, the enemies are still balanced around this 4-round rule, and the best thing to do is usually just still push out as much damage as fast as possible. I think one of the biggest issues DD2 has faced over its lifespan has been replayability, and I think it's because if you play this game as efficiently as possible, a lot of the damage dealers kind of just blend together. Not entirely, that's an exaggeration, but it is sort of felt after a while, and I feel like if you open up the game more in this way, that addresses that pretty directly. And again, even non-damage dealer centric characters can take another turn to come online and not feel like they're weighing down the team if you allow for it. But again, there are a lot of other issues that would come about with this. Heroes and enemies would need to be completely rebalanced. I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think that a new game would be the ideal place to do it. So I'm hopeful for something of this level of change. With that though, I've sort of covered everything that I felt fit into this video in particular. There's a lot more discussion to be had, obviously. I think it gets the most interesting when you go in and really pick apart individual pieces of hero kits and go into well, why does this move seem fine on paper, but kind of feel bad in a lot of encounters, or other similar issues? But this wasn't meant to be too much of a rant, as much as fun as that would maybe be in another video. So let me know if you'd like an actual elaboration on the tier list or something along those lines. I just saw that DD1 is getting DLC a month from now, which is honestly fucking crazy. I thought Red Hook had abandoned the game. Not that I blame them for it, but the fact that we're getting DLC in 2026 kind of blows my mind. It is pretty cool that they said it's hopefully not going to overlap too much with the pre-existing mods for Runaway and Duelist. Maybe I'll make a video on that, but it does come out 2 days before my schedule goes back to Blood Moon difficulty, so we'll have to see. Anyways, I think that's it, so thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you next time.